This was not supposed to happen. In 2026, US goods exports to Canada dropped by $13.4 billion.
The United States is flagging what it calls trade irritants in a new report, and it cites several measures here in Canada, including the federal government's Buy Canadian procurement policy and the decision to pull American alcohol off the shelves.
I don't buy anything American. I don't go to the States anymore.
Imports from Canada fell by $28.9 billion. And those are not estimates. Those are official numbers straight from the US Trade Representative. The United States is flagging what it calls trade irritants in a new report, and it cites several measures here in Canada, including the federal government's Buy Canadian procurement policy and the decision to pull American alcohol off the shelves. I don't buy anything American. I don't go to the States anymore.
Canadian provision was put in place because of the trade war with the US. And some companies point out it's only fair because the Americans have a similar rule on their side of the border.
For months, the plan in Washington looked simple. Apply pressure, tighten tariffs, and Canada would eventually bend. But the data coming in right now isn't showing Canada struggling. It's showing the United States hurting. And the shift is happening quietly, almost unnoticed.
The federal government announced its Buy Canadian policy in December in response to U.S. tariffs. And while American businesses say they have a hard time fighting for contracts, some point out the U.S. has a similar policy on their side of the border.
Canadian procurement was put in place because of the trade war with the US, and some companies point out it's only fair because the Americans have a similar rule on their side of the border. At first, everything followed the usual script, but then the numbers started coming in, and that's where things began to feel different. Canada sends roughly 73% of its exports to the United States. That kind of dependency looked like leverage to Washington. It looked like a pressure point that would eventually force a conversation on Trump's terms.
When it comes to grocery shopping, if it's American, Scott Proudfoot isn't buying it.
It's about buying Canadian, but also, frankly, just not buying American.
But here's what Washington didn't account for. Canada was not going to sit still, and the moment Trump made his move, Canada started making its own. Instead of reacting randomly, Canada aligned everything: policy, behavior, and incentives, all moving in the same direction at the same time. And that's when the direction of pressure slowly began to change. This shift didn't happen overnight. It happened in layers. Consumers in Canada started changing how they shop. Not dramatically, not loudly, but consistently. Checking labels, avoiding American products, choosing domestic alternatives. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And that kind of change is hard to reverse.
It has been evolving dynamically. In fact, most of our clients prefer to purchase Canadian products.
When it comes to grocery shopping, if it's American, Scott Proudfoot isn't buying it. It's about buying Canadian, but also, frankly, just not buying American.
A funny one to raise, given if you take a look at what exists over on the U.S. side, they do have their own, buy American goods when it comes to their federal procurements.
The report also raises concerns about the decision by several provinces to pull American liquor off the shelves and tariffs on U.S. dairy products. South of the border, officials warn these issues could complicate further trade talks ahead of the review of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement.
At the same time, government policies started reinforcing that behavior, pushing large contracts toward domestic companies, slowly reducing reliance on foreign suppliers, and doing it in a way that didn't create sudden shock, but steady pressure. And then something very visible happened, something that turned this from quiet strategy into measurable impact. American alcohol removed from major provincial shelves. Not reduced, not limited, removed. $1 billion market disrupted almost instantly. And that's when US businesses started to feel something very real. But this is where things take a serious turn, because this isn't just about one sector or one decision. It's about how multiple layers of pressure started hitting at the same time. When exports drop, companies feel it. When contracts disappear, industries feel it. When consumer behavior shifts, the effect multiplies.
We need to inflict pain on the United States so that they can understand that this kind of behavior towards their allies is just not on.
And when all of that happens together, it stops being temporary. Quick pause. If you want breakdowns that actually make sense of global shifts like this, hit subscribe. It helps more than you think. Now here's the part that most people overlook, and the numbers make it impossible to ignore. By the end of 2025, Statistics Canada confirmed Canadian land travel to the United States dropped 30.9% for the full year. That is 7.6 million fewer vehicles crossing the border, not a rounding error, not a seasonal dip, a structural collapse in cross-border movement. A Congressional Joint Economic Committee report found declines of up to 28% in individual border states. In Montana, Canadian visitors contributed $170 million to the state economy in 2024. In 2025, border crossings were down 19%. In New Hampshire, campground reservations from Canadians dropped 71%. One hotel owner in North Conway reported 30% of their rooms sitting empty during summer weekends that used to sell out completely. These numbers are showing up in empty hotel rooms, closed shifts, and businesses that may not come back, and it goes deeper than tourism. Canada's share of exports going to the United States fell from nearly 76% in 2024 down to 71.7% by end of 2025, the lowest share since the early 1980s. Think about what that means. An economic relationship that took 4 decades to build is now unwinding. And it isn't unwinding because of a policy change, it's unwinding because of a shift in trust. At the same time, Canadian exports to non-US markets rose 17.2%, reaching an all-time high. Countries like the United Kingdom, China, and Brazil are now absorbing Canadian goods that used to go south. That is not a temporary detour, that is a structural redirect. And Washington did not plan for it. But ask yourself this, who is actually feeling the pressure right now? It's not just governments, it's manufacturers losing access, exporters watching demand fall, service industries like tourism quietly bleeding in the background. Steel product exports from Canada to the US fell 24% in 2025. Aluminum export volumes dropped 15%. Motor vehicle exports were disrupted by back-and-forth tariffs that made planning almost impossible. And each of these adds a new layer of internal pressure on the American economy. Not on Canada's. Tariffs can be negotiated. Policies can be changed. But behavior is different. Once consumers shift their habits, they don't always go back. Once supply chains adjust, they don't reset overnight. Once contracts move, they rarely return quickly. And that means what we're seeing right now isn't just disruption. It's a structural shift, and the evidence is showing up in official reports being presented directly to decision makers on both sides of the border, which tells you this is no longer a background issue. It's moving to the center of the conversation. And the final consequence could be much bigger than expected. Because once economic pressure starts flowing both ways, it doesn't just affect one country. It reshapes the relationship itself. The balance starts shifting, slowly at first, then all at once. And that's the real story here. Not just what is happening on the surface, but what is changing underneath. Trump's plan assumed Canada would fold. Canada didn't fold. And now Washington is staring at numbers it didn't expect from a country it underestimated in a trade war that is no longer moving in one direction. Because when the data starts reflecting a different reality than the original plan, ignoring it stops being an option. And right now, that shift is already underway.